The Galactic Council chamber was quiet as the old ambassador walked to the center of the room. His name was Hal, and he belonged to the species. He had 4 eyes, gray skin, and legs that bent in ways that would make any human uncomfortable. He was 900 years old, which was considered middle-aged for his kind, and he had seen many things in his long life, but nothing had affected him quite like the story he was about to tell. The young delegates sat in their floating chairs, representing dozens of species from across the galaxy. They were new to the council, fresh and eager, and they had many questions about the strange rules that governed galactic civilization. One rule in particular had confused them since the day they arrived. Directive 7 Omega stated very clearly that no vessel belonging to any species in the Galactic Council was allowed to perform a deep scan on a human military warship. The punishment for breaking this rule was severe. The directive had been in place for 30 years, and in all that time, no one had explained why it existed. Until today. Hal cleared his throat and looked at the young faces before him. Some had scales, some had feathers, some had no faces at all, communicating through colors that rippled across their bodies. All of them were watching him with intense curiosity. "You want to know about the humans," Hal said. His voice was rough, like gravel being crushed under heavy boots. "You want to know why we fear them. You want to know why we do not scan their warships." A young delegate from the cluster raised one of her many arms. "Ambassador, with respect, we have seen the human vessels. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. Their weapons are weak. Their shields can barely stop a standard plasma bolt. Why would we fear them at all?" Hal smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That is exactly what we thought 30 years ago. That is exactly what the High Commander of the fleet thought when the first human warship arrived at Prime. We thought they were nothing. We thought they were just another primitive species crawling out of their little corner of the galaxy. We were wrong." He pressed a button on his wrist device, and a holographic image appeared in the center of the chamber. It showed a human warship, long and gray, with the words USS Valiant painted on its side. The ship looked old and tired compared to the sleek vessels of the Council fleet. "This was the first human military vessel to make contact with us," Hal continued. "It was commanded by a man named Daniel Carter. He had gray hair, a calm voice, and eyes that seemed to look right through you. When he arrived at Prime, we greeted him with the standard protocols. We offered him food, shelter, and the chance to join our great civilization." The image changed to show Captain Carter standing on the deck of his ship. He was holding a cup of something brown and steaming. His crew moved around him, performing their duties with quiet efficiency. "Captain Carter was polite," Hal said. "He accepted our offer of friendship. He asked questions about our technology, our history, our customs. He seemed genuinely interested in learning about us. And while he was being friendly, we did what we always did with new species." He paused and looked at the young delegates. "We scanned his ship." A murmur went through the chamber. Scanning was standard procedure. Every new species that joined the Council had their vessels scanned. It was how the Council assessed threats and opportunities. It was how they learned about new technologies and new resources. No species had ever objected to being scanned because no species had ever had anything to hide. "The scan began at 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time," Hal said. "Scanner Chief was in charge of the operation. He was the best in the fleet. He had scanned thousands of vessels from hundreds of species. He knew every signature, every pattern, every anomaly. Nothing surprised him anymore." The holographic image changed again, showing the interior of a scanning station. Dozens of screens displayed data in flowing symbols that the young delegates could not read. "The first layer of the scan showed nothing unusual," Hal continued. "Primitive fusion reactors, basic shield generators, weapons that barely registered on our threat scales. We almost stopped the scan right there. We almost decided that the humans were not worth our attention." He took a deep breath, but was thorough. He always completed his scans, so he went deeper. He penetrated the hull, the corridors, the crew quarters, and that is when everything changed. The chamber was completely silent now. Even the species that did not breathe seemed to be holding their breath. "Found the crew," Hal said, "all 240 of them, and he made a discovery that would haunt him for the rest of his life." He looked at each delegate in turn, making sure they understood the weight of what he was about to say. The humans were awake. The delegate tilted her head in confusion. "Awake? I do not understand. Why would that be significant?" Hal nodded slowly. "I forget that your species uses a different method of travel. Let me explain. The journey from Earth to Prime takes 14 months at faster-than-light speeds, 14 months of travel through the empty void between stars. Every known species in the galaxy requires stasis for journeys longer than 3 weeks. Our minds cannot handle the emptiness. The silence drives us mad. The isolation breaks us down until we become violent and dangerous." He gestured at the image of the human crew. But these humans had been awake for the entire journey. 14 months of conscious travel through the darkest parts of space. And they were not mad. They were not broken. They were playing cards in their recreation room. They were exercising in their gymnasium. They were reading books and writing letters and sleeping in regular cycles as if nothing was wrong. Hal's 4 eyes grew dark with the memory. Ran the scan 3 times. He checked his equipment for errors. He consulted with the ship's computer and with his fellow officers. The results were always the same. The humans were perfectly healthy, perfectly sane, and perfectly calm. He turned off the holographic display and stood in the dim light of the chamber. That was the first sign that we were dealing with something we did not understand, but it was only the beginning. The deeper scanned, the more disturbing the truth became, and by the time he was finished, he was no longer the same person. Hal walked toward the exit, then stopped and looked back at the young delegates. "Tomorrow I will tell you what else found. I will tell you about the human body, the human mind, and the human spirit. And then you will understand why Directive 7 Omega exists. You will understand why we do not scan human warships." He paused at the door. "And you will understand why, in a galaxy full of ancient empires and powerful civilizations, the species we fear most is a group of soft, fragile creatures from a small blue planet who should have died 1,000 times over but simply refused to do so." The door closed behind him, leaving the young delegates alone with their thoughts and their growing sense of unease. The next day came quickly for the young delegates of the Galactic Council. They had spent the night discussing what Ambassador Hal had told them, trying to understand why the fact that humans stayed awake during space travel was so significant. Some of them thought the old ambassador was exaggerating. Some of them thought he was simply trying to scare them. But when he entered the chamber that morning, the look in his 4 eyes told them that everything he had said was true. Hal did not waste time with greetings or pleasantries. He walked to the center of the room and activated the holographic display. The image showed Scanner Chief sitting at his station aboard the flagship. He was a tall creature with 6 legs and a body covered in hard plates. His eyes were focused on the screens in front of him, and his fingers moved rapidly across the controls. "This recording was made 30 years ago," Hal said. "What you are about to see has never been shown to anyone outside the High Council. It is classified at the highest level because the Council believes that if this information became public, it would cause widespread panic across the galaxy." The young delegates leaned forward in their seats. The delegate who had asked questions the day before was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly that her scales had turned white. The recording began to play, was conducting the deep scan of the USS Valiant, and everything seemed normal at first. Numbers and symbols flowed across his screens, showing the basic structure of the human vessel. Then the scan penetrated the crew quarters, and its entire body went rigid. "Impossible," whispered in the recording. His voice was shaking. "This cannot be correct." High Commander appeared behind him. He was the leader of the fleet, a massive creature with scars covering half his face. He had fought in 12 wars and had never shown fear in his life. But when he looked at screens, his expression changed. "What am I looking at?" demanded. The humans replied. "They are awake, all of them, for the entire journey." Stared at the screens for a long moment. "That is not possible. Run the scan again." Ran the scan again. The results were the same. The humans were awake, alert, and showing no signs of psychological damage. Some of them were eating in a large room filled with tables. Others were running on machines that went nowhere. One human was sitting alone in a small room, moving his fingers across a device that made strange sounds. "He is playing music," said quietly. "He is playing music for himself in the middle of space, 14 months from home, and he is smiling." Step back from the screens. Continue the scan. I want to know everything about these creatures. Nodded and went deeper. He accessed the ship's medical database, pulling up files on each member of the crew. What he found there would change his understanding of life in the universe forever. The recording paused, and Hal looked at the young delegates. "What discovered in those medical files was beyond anything we had ever encountered," he said. "You see, every species in the galaxy has evolved to survive. We have developed defenses against predators, against disease, against the dangers of our home worlds. But the humans had evolved in ways that seemed impossible." He resumed the recording, was scrolling through the medical files, his eyes growing wider with each page. "Their immune systems," said. "Look at their immune systems. They are constantly at war. Every single human carries billions of microscopic organisms inside their bodies. Some of these organisms help them survive. Others try to kill them. And their bodies fight this war every second of every day without them even knowing." Frowned. "All species have immune systems." "Not like this," replied. "Their immune systems learn. When they encounter a new threat, they adapt. They create new defenses. They remember every enemy they have ever faced and they prepare for future attacks. It is like having a tiny army inside your body that never sleeps, never stops fighting, and never gives up." The recording showed more data flowing across the screens. The young delegates watched in silence as explained what he was seeing. "Their bones," continued. "When a human breaks a bone, it heals. That is not unusual. Many species can heal broken bones, but human bones heal stronger than they were before. The break point becomes harder, more resistant. It is as if their bodies expect to be damaged again and they prepare for it." He pulled up another file. "Their muscles work the same way. When humans use their muscles beyond their normal limits, the muscles tear. Tiny injuries all through the tissue. In any other species, this would be considered damage. The body would need time to recover. But in humans, the muscles repair themselves and become larger, stronger than before. They call this exercise. They damage themselves on purpose to make themselves more powerful." Was now standing completely still, his face frozen in an expression of disbelief. "But that is not the most disturbing part," said. His voice had dropped to almost a whisper. "I have found their psychological profiles. I have found what happens inside their minds when they face danger." He pulled up a diagram of a human brain. Different areas were highlighted in different colors. When a human is threatened, their body releases a chemical called adrenaline. This chemical increases their heart rate, sharpens their senses, and floods their muscles with energy. It allows them to run faster, hit harder, and think more quickly than they normally could. They call this the fight or flight response. Nodded slowly. "Many species have similar responses." "Yes," agreed. "But in humans, this response can be triggered by things that are not real. They can watch a story about danger and feel the same chemical response. They can remember past dangers and experience the same physical effects. They can even imagine future dangers that may never happen, and their bodies will prepare as if the threat is real." He turned to face the High Commander directly. Do you understand what this means? Humans can train themselves to face danger without ever being in actual danger. They can make their bodies stronger, faster, and more alert simply by thinking about threats. Their minds have complete control over their physical responses. The recording showed taking a step backward, something the young delegates had never seen any commander do. "There is one more thing," said, "something I found in their historical records, something that explains why they are the way they are." He pulled up an image of Earth, the human home world. It was a small blue planet covered in water and green land. "The humans call their planet a paradise," said, "but our analysis shows something different. Their planet has extreme temperature variations, violent weather patterns, and regular geological disasters. It is covered in predators, parasites, and poisonous plants. By our standards, Earth is not a paradise." He looked at the High Commander with something close to fear in his eyes. "Earth is a death world, and the humans are not its victims, they are its survivors." The recording ended, and the chamber fell into complete silence. The young delegates sat motionless, trying to process what they had just witnessed. Hal turned off the holographic display and stood in the darkness. "Now you begin to understand," he said quietly. "The humans did not evolve to live in comfort. They evolved to survive in hell, and that was only the beginning of what we learned about them." Lieutenant Brooks was standing at his station aboard the USS Valiant when he noticed something strange. The alien ships that had surrounded them since their arrival at Prime were moving away. Not just one or two ships, but all of them. The entire fleet was pulling back to a safe distance, as if they had suddenly realized they were too close to something dangerous. "Captain said, the alien vessels are retreating." Captain Daniel Carter looked up from his coffee and glanced at the alien ships were indeed moving away, their sleek hulls reflecting the light of the nearby star. He watched them for a moment, then shrugged and took another sip of his drink. "Probably just a routine formation change," he said. "Keep monitoring them, Lieutenant." Nodded and returned to his work. He had no idea that at this very moment, they were experiencing the first stages of what would later be called the human panic. He had no idea that Scanner Chief had just accessed the psychological files of the Valiant's crew and discovered things that would haunt the Galactic Council for generations. Aboard the flagship was no longer sitting at his station. He was standing in the middle of the scanning room, his 6 legs trembling so badly that he could barely stay upright. High Commander was beside him, reading the data on the screens with an expression of growing horror. "Explain this to me," said quietly. "Explain what I am looking at." Took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. "The humans experience something called grief," he said. "It is a response to losing someone they care about. When a human loses a family member or a close friend, their brain produces chemicals that cause intense emotional pain. This pain can last for months or even years." Nodded slowly. "Many species experience loss. We understand this concept." "Yes," agreed. "But what the humans do with their grief is different. Instead of shutting down, instead of withdrawing from the world to protect themselves from further pain, they convert the grief into something else." He pulled up a psychological profile of one of the Valiant's crew members. Her name was Lisa Morgan, and she was the ship's second in command. "Commander Morgan lost her father 3 years ago," explained. "According to these records, she was devastated. She experienced all the symptoms of severe grief, including loss of appetite, difficulty sleeping, and periods of intense sadness." He pointed to a section of the file. "But then something happened. Instead of remaining in this state, her brain began to transform the grief into determination. She applied for advanced training programs. She took on extra responsibilities. She pushed herself harder than ever before. Within 1 year, she had been promoted twice and was assigned to the most important mission in human history." Stared at the file. "She used her pain as fuel." "Exactly," said. "And she is not unusual. According to these records, this is a common human response to loss. They take their grief and they use it to drive themselves forward. They call it honoring the memory of the dead. He pulled up more files, showing similar patterns across the entire crew. But that is not all, continued. The humans have another concept that we do not share. They call it revenge. The word did not translate properly into the language, frowned and asked for clarification. Revenge is the desire to cause harm to someone who has harmed you, explained. If a human is hurt by another being, they do not simply avoid that being in the future. They actively seek to hurt that being in return, and this desire can last for their entire lives. His eyes widened. They remember those who wrong them. They do more than remember, said. They form what they call grudges. A grudge is a deep, lasting anger toward someone who has caused them harm. Humans can carry grudges for years, decades, even generations. There are records of human families who maintained grudges against other families for centuries. He pulled up historical data from Earth, showing images of ancient wars and conflicts. Their history is filled with examples of this behavior. Entire nations have gone to war over insults that happened hundreds of years before anyone alive was born. They have a saying that captures this perfectly. They say that revenge is a dish best served cold. It means that they are willing to wait as long as necessary to repay those who have wronged them. Was silent for a long moment. Then he asked a question that would come to define the Council's understanding of humanity. What happens when you wrong a human and they cannot take revenge immediately? Pulled up another file. They wait, they plan, they prepare, and when the opportunity finally comes, they strike without mercy. There is a human story about a man who spent 20 years planning his revenge against those who had wronged him. 20 years of careful preparation, of hiding his true intentions, of pretending to be something he was not. And when he finally acted, his revenge was complete and devastating. The recording of this conversation was playing in the Galactic Council chamber, and the young delegates were watching with a mixture of fascination and fear. Ambassador Hal stood beside the holographic display, his 4 eyes fixed on the images before him. We learned many things about humans that day, Hal said. We learned that they can survive damage that would kill any other species. We learned that they grow stronger from adversity. We learned that they carry their dead with them, using grief as a source of power. And we learned that they never forget those who harm them. He paused and looked at the young delegates. But the most disturbing discovery was yet to come. Continued his scan, going deeper into the human psyche, and he found something that would change everything. The recording resumed, was now sitting on the floor of the scanning room, his legs folded beneath him. His eyes were empty, like those of someone who had seen too much. They have something called hope, whispered. It is a belief that things will get better, even when all evidence suggests otherwise. It is a refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat is certain. Knelt beside his scanner chief. I do not understand. Neither did I, replied. So I looked deeper. I found their stories, their myths, their legends, and I discovered something terrifying. He looked up at the High Commander, with tears in his multiple eyes. Humans celebrate those who fight against impossible odds. They worship those who refuse to surrender. Their greatest heroes are not those who achieved easy victories, but those who faced certain death and kept fighting anyway. They have a word for this. They call it courage. His voice broke. They are not afraid of death, Commander. They are afraid of giving up. And that is something we cannot fight. That is something we cannot overcome. Because you can kill a human, but you cannot make them stop hopping. You can destroy their bodies, but you cannot break their spirits. The recording ended, and the chamber fell silent. Hal turned to face the young delegates. Now you understand why we pulled our ships back that day, he said. Now you understand why we looked at that primitive vessel with its weak weapons and basic technology, and we felt fear for the first time in 1,000 years. He walked toward the exit, then stopped and looked back. Tomorrow I will tell you about the incident at Nexus Station. I will tell you what happened when a young officer ignored Directive 7 Omega and scanned a human warship without permission. And then you will understand why that directive exists. 20 years had passed since the first scan of the USS Valiant. In that time, humanity had grown from a curious newcomer to a respected member of the galactic community. They had established colonies on dozens of worlds, developed trade relationships with multiple species, and proven themselves to be reliable allies in times of need. The Galactic Council had watched them carefully, always keeping their distance, always remembering what Scanner Chief had discovered all those years ago. Directive 7 Omega remained in effect. No vessel was permitted to scan a human military warship. The punishment for breaking this rule was immediate exile from the Council and complete isolation from galactic civilization. It was the harshest penalty the Council had ever created, and it applied to only one specific action. Most species obeyed the directive without question. They had heard the stories. They had seen what happened to who had spent the rest of his life in a quiet treatment facility, unable to work, unable to function in normal society. They understood that some knowledge was too dangerous to possess. But there were always those who thought they knew better. They were a young species, ambitious and proud. They had joined the Council only 5 years earlier, and they had quickly become frustrated with what they saw as unnecessary restrictions. Their technology was advanced, their military was strong, and they did not understand why the older species treated the humans with such respect. Officer Al was especially frustrated. He was young, talented, and eager to prove himself. He had been assigned to Nexus Station, a neutral trading post where dozens of species conducted business. When the human warship USS Defiance arrived for a routine trade negotiation, Al saw an opportunity. Admiral commanded the Defiance. She was a small woman with short gray hair and a calm demeanor that seemed to put everyone at ease. When she stepped off her shuttle onto Nexus Station, she greeted the alien delegates with genuine warmth. She made small talk, asked about their families, and expressed interest in their cultures. Al watched her from a distance, his scanner hidden beneath his uniform. He did not see a dangerous creature. He saw a fragile being with soft skin and weak muscles. He could not understand why his superiors were so afraid of these humans. The trade negotiations began, and Admiral proved to be a skilled diplomat. She listened carefully to each proposal, asked thoughtful questions, and offered compromises that benefited all parties. The delegation was impressed despite themselves. They had expected the humans to be aggressive and demanding. Instead, they found a reasonable partner who seemed genuinely interested in building a lasting relationship. But Al was not interested in trade negotiations. While the Admiral was busy in the conference room, he activated his scanner and pointed it at the Defiance. The ship was docked at the far end of the station, its gray hull gleaming under the artificial lights. Al's scanner penetrated the outer layers easily, revealing the same primitive technology that they had discovered 20 years earlier. Weak reactors, basic shields, weapons that barely registered on his threat scales. He smiled to himself. This was what the Council feared. This was the reason for Directive 7 Omega. He would show them that the humans were nothing special. He would prove that the older species were cowards who had been frightened by shadows. The deep scan reached the crew quarters, and Al began examining the individual crew members. There were 300 humans aboard the Defiance, each one going about their daily duties. Some were working at their stations. Some were eating in the mess hall. Some were sleeping in their quarters. Then his scanner locked onto a young male in the ship's gymnasium. His name was Tyler Grant, and he was 24 years old. According to his file, he had recently lost his brother in a mining accident on a distant colony. The accident had been sudden and unexpected. One moment his brother was alive, the next he was gone, buried under tons of collapsed rock. Al expected to find a broken man. He expected to see someone who had withdrawn from life, someone who was unable to function, someone who needed help and support just to get through each day. What he found was something very different. Tyler Grant was lifting weights, heavy weights, far heavier than his body should have been able to handle. Sweat was pouring down his face, and tears were streaming from his eyes. He was crying and exercising at the same time, pushing his body beyond its limits while his mind processed the grief of losing his brother. Al accessed Tyler's psychological profile, trying to understand what he was seeing. The data that flooded his scanner was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Tyler's brain was producing enormous amounts of chemicals that the scanner identified as determination, anger, and something the humans called resolve. His heart rate was elevated. His muscles were tearing and repairing themselves in real time. His entire body was transforming, becoming stronger, faster, more powerful. And according to his file, Tyler had requested a transfer to the most dangerous patrol route in human space. He wanted to protect others from experiencing what he had experienced. He wanted to make sure that no other family would have to suffer the way his family had suffered. He was taking his grief and turning it into a weapon. Al felt his scanner slip from his fingers. His mind was struggling to process what he was seeing. In his culture, loss was followed by a period of mourning, then acceptance, then return to normal life. The idea of using grief as fuel, of transforming pain into power, was completely foreign to him. He accessed more files, hopping to find something he could understand. Instead, he found stories that made his blood run cold. One crew member had survived a childhood disease that should have killed him. Instead of being weakened by the experience, he had become a doctor who specialized in treating that same disease. He had saved hundreds of lives because he had almost died. Another crew member had been abandoned by her parents as a child. Instead of becoming bitter and withdrawn, she had dedicated her life to helping other abandoned children. She had founded organizations that provided care for thousands of young people who had no one else. A third crew member had lost his legs in combat. Instead of retiring to live a quiet life, he had requested artificial replacements and returned to active duty. He was now one of the most decorated officers in the human fleet. Everywhere Al looked, he found the same pattern. Humans took their worst experiences and used them as motivation. They turned tragedy into triumph. They transformed wounds into wisdom. His scanner showed him one final piece of data. It was a phrase that the humans used often, a simple statement that seemed to capture their entire philosophy. "What does not kill me makes me stronger." Al stared at those words for a long moment. Then his mind simply stopped working. The contradiction was too much for him to handle. In his understanding of the universe, damage was damage. Pain was pain. Loss was loss. The idea that these things could make someone stronger was like being told that fire made things colder or that darkness created light. His fellow officers found him an hour later, sitting on the floor of the observation deck, staring at nothing. He was speaking in fragments, repeating phrases that made no sense. He kept saying that the humans were broken, that they were damaged, but they were also the strongest beings he had ever seen. The physicians tried to help him, but his mind had suffered a fundamental break. He could not reconcile what he had learned with what he believed to be true. The contradiction destroyed him. Admiral never learned what happened to Al. She concluded her trade negotiations successfully and returned to the Defiance. The delegation agreed to every term she proposed without a single objection. Some of the human officers thought this was strange. Admiral just smiled and sipped her coffee, the same way Captain Carter had smiled all those years ago. Meanwhile, back on Nexus Station, the High Command quietly issued an order. No vessel would ever scan a human ship again. They did not explain why. They did not need to. Al had already shown them. The final day of Ambassador Hal's presentation had arrived. The young delegates of the Galactic Council had spent 4 days listening to his stories, watching his recordings, and trying to understand why the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy treated humanity with such careful respect. Now they were about to learn the final truth. Hal entered the chamber slowly, his 4 eyes heavy with the weight of centuries. He did not activate the holographic display. He did not show any recordings or files. Instead, he simply walked to the center of the room and stood there in silence for a long moment. "I have told you about the physical resilience of humans," he said at last. "I have told you about their psychological strength. I have told you about their ability to transform pain into power and grief into determination. But I have not yet told you the real reason we fear them." He looked at each young delegate in turn, making sure they were paying attention. "We do not fear their weapons. Their technology is primitive compared to ours. A single warship could destroy a dozen human vessels in open combat. We do not fear their numbers. There are fewer humans in the galaxy than almost any other species. We do not even fear their resilience, as impressive as it is." He paused and took a deep breath. "We fear what we find when we look inside them. We fear the thing that makes them human." The delegate raised her arm. "Ambassador, with respect, you have been speaking in riddles for days. Please tell us plainly what it is that you fear." Hal nodded slowly. "Very well, I will tell you plainly." He walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars. In the distance, a human cargo vessel was passing by, its running lights blinking steadily in the darkness. When we scan a human warship, we see creatures who know they are going to die. Every human understands that their life is limited. They measure their existence in decades, not centuries or like most species. They know that their bodies will weaken, their minds will slow, and eventually they will cease to exist. He turned back to face the delegates. This knowledge should break them. It should fill them with despair and hopelessness. It should make them cautious, fearful, unwilling to take risks, but instead it does the opposite. He walked back to the center of the room. Humans do not fear death. They fear wasting the time they have. They fear reaching the end of their lives without having done something meaningful. They fear being forgotten more than they fear dying. The young delegates were silent, trying to understand what he was saying. "This is why they take risks that other species would never consider," Hal continued. "This is why they explore dangerous regions of space, why they colonize hostile worlds, why they push their bodies and minds to the breaking point. They know they are running out of time, and they refuse to waste a single moment." He pulled up a simple image on the holographic display. It showed a human woman sitting on a hillside, watching a sunset. She was old, her hair white, her face lined with age, but she was smiling. "This image was captured by one of our observation drones," Hal said. "The woman's name was Grace, and she was 97 years old. She had lived a full life. She had raised children, built a career, traveled across her world, and experienced countless adventures. And on this day, she was watching her final sunset." He looked at the image with something approaching wonder. "Our analysts studied this image for years, trying to understand what they were seeing. The woman knew she was dying. She knew this would be her last day. And yet she was not afraid. She was not sad. She was at peace." He turned off the display. "When we asked our human contacts about this, they explained something that we could not comprehend. They said that death gives life meaning. They said that because their time is limited, every moment becomes precious. They said that the knowledge of death is what makes life worth living." The delegate shook her head slowly. "I do not understand. How can the certainty of death bring peace?" Hal smiled sadly. "Neither do we, and that is exactly the problem." He began to pace around the room, his footsteps echoing in the silence. "We are ancient species. Some of us live for thousands of years. We have time to wait, time to plan, time to be careful. We do not feel the urgency that humans feel. We do not understand what it means to have only a few decades to accomplish everything you want to accomplish. He stopped packing and looked at the young delegates. When we scan a human warship, we see beings who are racing against time. Every decision they make is influenced by the knowledge that they will not live forever. Every action they take is driven by the need to make their limited time count. He shook his head slowly. And we see something else, something that terrifies us more than anything else in the universe. The chamber was completely silent. Even the species that did not breathe seemed to be holding their breath. "We see hope," Hal said quietly. "Despite everything, despite knowing that they will die, despite facing a universe that is vast and indifferent to their existence, humans carry hope inside them. They believe that tomorrow will be better than today. They believe that their actions matter. They believe that they can make a difference." He walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars again. The human cargo vessel had moved on, replaced by empty space filled with distant suns. "We cannot fight hope," Hal said. "We cannot defeat it. We cannot understand it. And when we scan a human warship, we are forced to confront a truth that shakes us to our core." He turned to face the delegates one final time. In a galaxy filled with ancient empires and powerful civilizations, the most formidable species is a collection of fragile creatures from a small blue planet who live for only a few decades. They should be insignificant. They should be easy to ignore. But they are not, because they have looked into the void of their own mortality, and instead of falling into despair, they have found meaning. They have found purpose. They have found hope. He walked toward the exit, his footsteps slow and heavy. "That is why we do not scan human warships. That is why Directive 7 Omega exists. Not because we fear what we might learn about their weapons or their technology, but because every time we look inside a human, we are reminded of something we have lost." He stopped at the door and looked back at the young delegates. "We are reminded that somewhere along the way, in our endless lives and our vast empires, we forgot what it means to truly be alive." The door closed behind him, leaving the young delegates alone with their thoughts. Through the viewport, another human vessel was approaching the station. Through its windows, they could see the crew moving about, laughing at some joke, living their short and precious lives to the fullest. And for the first time, the young delegates understood why the Galactic Council would never scan a human warship again. Some truths were too powerful to face. Some lights were too bright to look upon. And some species were simply too alive to be understood by those who had forgotten what it meant to be mortal. Far away, aboard the USS Legacy, an old man named Daniel Carter sat in the observation deck, watching the stars drift by. He was retired now, but he still liked to spend time on human vessels, surrounded by the young officers who reminded him of his own youth. He had never understood why the aliens treated humans with such careful respect. He had never learned about the scans, the files, or the breakdowns that had followed. He only knew that whenever a human ship arrived at an alien station, the other species gave them plenty of room. He took a sip of his coffee and smiled. Some mysteries, he supposed, were better left unsolved. And somewhere in the vast reaches of space, the stars continued to burn, indifferent to the tiny creatures who looked up at them with wonder and hope. But among all those tiny creatures, only the humans looked at the stars and saw not an ending, but a beginning. And that made all the difference.